Right, it is just after 12:05, so we're going to get started, but I want to confirm everybody can hear and also see the screen share. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. John Straffolino, and currently I am the Acting Dean of Arts and Sciences at Germanna Community College, where I also serve as an Associate Professor of Health and Physical Education. I additionally serve as an adjunct faculty at Bucks County Community College in the Department of Kinesiology and Sports Studies. I've been teaching higher education for over 20 years, and I've taught online for most of that time. One of the things that I always reflect back to one of my colleagues at Bucks, Dr. Bill Ford, he kind of talked about the metaphor of teaching in a semester as an Etch-a-Sketch. So at the end of every semester, you kind of can shake out what you like, what you don't like, and kind of remap and change things. And I really take that into account when I plan from semester to semester. And it's really guided me to refine my classes so that I can really work to meet the changing needs for students. So in today's presentation, what I am focusing on is a course that I redesigned to better improve physical literacy. And when we look at physical literacy, it's a relatively new concept. It was originally coined by Margaret Whitehead in 2010, and it includes four basic components. So we have daily behavior. Are individuals being active? Is there knowledge relative to the concepts of being physically active, or even with disease risk and mediation prevention? Self-efficacy. How confident are they at performing different types of activities? And then we get into the fourth component, which is motivation. But each of these four components, they form together to look at this construct of physical literacy. And ultimately, the goal of being physical literate or achieving physical literacy is to be physically active throughout your lifetime. And one of the things that you may see from our students, or even from ourselves or your peers, colleagues, friends, their physical activity may change as they move through their lifetime. So those are some of the challenges that students may have. And we have an optimal time in the college years to kind of address that and help shape them and set them up for a better future. So we look at the current physical activity recommendations. These are set forth by the CDC, and we look at 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity activity. And those are weekly totals. And physical activity, there's numerous studies about the impact that physical activity will have on decreasing the risk of many diseases. So there is a direct relationship between disease risk and being physically active. But unfortunately, most of the United States population doesn't receive adequate physical activity. They're not able to achieve that. And in addition to the 150 minutes of moderate intensity or the 75 minutes of vigorous activity, it's also important for individuals to include 2 or more days of resistance training for all major muscle groups. Those are the current recommendations that we have. And we look at physical literacy. Much of the research on physical literacy has revolved around the youth in terms of the K to 8, K to 12 arena. But engagement in physical activity and also this development of physical literacy, it's important that it continues and becomes addressed in the college years. Because during these time frames, this is when students have a chance, an opportunity to continually shape their lives. So when we look at in terms of addressing the aerobic fitness recommendations from the previous slide, and specifically looking at undergraduate students, there's a recent study from the ACHA in 2021 that showed only 45.8% of students met the moderate physical activity recommendations, and only 35.6% of those same students, undergraduate students, met the vigorous physical activity thresholds. So those are things we look at. Now, I teach in community college, and there was another study that came out by Young and Associates in 2015, and they looked at physical activity recommendations from community college students. And their study suggested that only 20% of community college students meet the moderate or vigorous physical activity recommendations. So this is a little concerning because we look at in terms of different demands that community college students may have. They may be working full-time while going to classes. They may have families, all these different things, and they're struggling to be able to fit physical activity into the lifetime. The other thing that's concerning too is that there's been a trend of reducing or even eliminating physical education requirements in colleges. So many colleges fall into the category, many of these college students fall into the category of emerging adults. And this age group, from the latter years of high school into the mid to late 20s, they tend to lack structure. They may struggle to achieve adequate physical activity levels. So they're really a vulnerable population, and we need to work on how can we capture them? How can we make physical activity a priority? How can we do that so that they can see the impact that it's going to have as they move through their lifetime? And that's something that's important to think about. So there is a need to enhance physical activity, but not just physical, but the psychological, behavior skills that are all related to physical activity. And an environment that can help to foster autonomy and also competence is going to favor a development of intrinsic motivation, which is really what we want students to be able to do. We want everybody to be able to do something because they want to. They're doing it for themselves, and that's something that's very important. And online physical education could be a solution to help meet some of these needs. So while relying on online physical education, it does pose some challenges, and the main challenge is maintaining the integrity of the physical activity participation. It also presents many opportunities. So you have an access to a larger student base, and we also look at in terms of other measures that we can use. So we need to make sure that we're establishing comprehensive and objective measures that we can implement to evaluate the physical literacy. So if we're able to evaluate the physical literacy, we're going to be able to track changes for our students throughout the semester and the impact that that can have on their life moving forward. So looking at physical literacy, we talked about the 4 different components. So recently, one of my classes, it is a PED 116 class at my home institution of Germanna Community College. At Bucks County Community College, the same equivalent class is the KINS 170. But what I've done over the past few years is refined my existing class. It's an online physical education class, so it would be purposeful in developing and assessing physical literacy. So over these next slides, one of the things that I'm going to do is discuss each component of physical literacy. And we talk about self-efficacy, motivation, daily behavior, knowledge, and discuss some of the core strategies that we can use to develop each of these components. And then not just the core strategies, but how can we assess? How can we assess and see the growth, see the changes that are taking place within these? So the first thing we look at is self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is one's belief in their own ability and to participate in physical activity, for example, or be competent. And it's a factor that can lead to enhanced physical activity. So there are 4 main influencers of self-efficacy. I have these on the slides here. So when we look at in terms of past experience, so an experience, and some of you may have experienced this or heard students or other people talk about it, and it doesn't matter if it's a positive or a negative experience, that past experience may have a strong impact on their perceptions of physical activity moving forward. So we need to be aware of that. That can impact someone's self-efficacy. We also look at vicarious experiences. So sometimes individuals will be able to view use the lens, their own lens, and look through their peers at performing an activity successfully, and that can impact their own self-efficacy. So the other thing that's a caveat to that is physical activity that's performed by peers at a comparable level to the skill of the exerciser is something that can lead to better outcomes. Persuasion is next, and persuasion can come from positive social sources, and it could instill confidence in the exerciser. And then lastly, being aware or in tune with physiological cues that can make the exerciser focus on the physical activity at hand and not necessarily on the negative feelings. These are some things that we look at from a self-efficacy standpoint and some of the things that influence. So in terms of developing self-efficacy in a course, there's a few things that I've used over these past several years. One of them is weekly journals. So that's the main avenue that I use for self-reflection for students. And the weekly journals present opportunities for students to be reflective on the physical activity they completed throughout the previous week. And it also gives them an opportunity to address progress and look at strategies for an upcoming week relative to the physical activity behaviors. And those are things that I really focus on. And each week, giving feedback to the students, letting them know about some suggestions. So those are some things that we really look at. I then ask them to discuss the progress made on their chosen behavior and what they could specifically work on in the upcoming week. So as an instructor, it's important to provide, again, the weekly feedback, because that's something that can provide encouragement and also guidance. So some of the students, they come from a wide range where they may have different experiences. You may have people who are very competent with exercise. You may have people who are new to exercise. You may have people coming in with these past experiences that were negative. So this is an opportunity for them to discuss with instructor one-on-one in a weekly journal and provide feedback to them. So I also have opportunities in discussion groups. So one of the things that I've found is, instead of if I have a group of 28 students, and some of you may have done with online discussions, have one big discussion for everybody, they don't read everything. They don't engage with everybody. So what I do, I break it down to smaller groups, about 8 to 10 students, depending on how many students are in the class. And what I've gotten a lot of feedback from the students, they enjoy the smaller dialogue that they have, and they're able to interact with their peers. So those are some things that on a more intimate level and have better conversations. So with the smaller groups, they're more likely to read and respond to people versus a big group of students. And that's something that has really helped in terms of developing self-efficacy. Now, the other thing we look at in terms of assessing. So those are some strategies that I use to develop self-efficacy. We look at in terms of assessing. So with my classes, what I've started doing was do some initial assessments, midpoint assessments, and then end of the semester assessments. So they're looking at their self-efficacy, they're looking at their level of motivation, they're looking at their stage of change or where they are relative to their physical activity pattern. So assessing self-efficacy is important. And there's 2 different things that I look at. I look at task self-efficacy. And on the next slide, I'll get into something called scheduling self-efficacy. So task self-efficacy, it involves confidence in being able to complete an activity. So the questionnaire I use, it offers various questions. It looks at their confidence in performing different intensities of physical activity. So on this slide here, and I have an example of one of the questions used for students to assess their task self-efficacy. And for the self-efficacy assessment, students respond on what percent, how confident they are with each statement. So for this statement here, how confident are you that you can exercise at a moderate level without stopping for 10 minutes? And at the beginning of the survey, I kind of define what moderate intensity activities are. And then I talk about also what vigorous intensity activities are. So they have a little bit of a framework for what they're looking at in terms of assessing. So 0% all the way up to 100% in terms of how confident they are. And then with the task self-efficacy, I previously used Qualtrics, and it would and all the surveys on there would average everything and give them a score for their overall task self-efficacy. And then the same thing for scheduling self-efficacy as well. I don't have access to Qualtrics anymore, but what I have done is developed a Google Sheet where it calculates everything for them and they get the data. So for these assessments they're doing at the beginning of the semester, they either get full credit or no credit. So the big thing is just they're able to do it. And they're using some of the results. So they're talking about these smaller groups about their self-efficacy, about their motivation. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But scheduling self-efficacy is something else that they assess. So task self-efficacy and then scheduling self-efficacy. And this revolves around being confident in being able to plan physical activity at an appropriate intensity, working around barriers that one may encounter. And one of the things that you often hear with physical activity, people talk about lack of time. And often I always use the perceived lack of time. People make time for things they want to do, but they don't always make time for everything. So this perceived lack of time. So this is something else in terms of looking at how they can schedule the activity. So on this slide, again, there's another example for one of the questions. So how confident are you that you can schedule any moderate intensity exercise during a typical week? And that's something, again, there's several questions, and I'll average them and give them an overall percentage score. So that's when we get into self-efficacy. The next thing that we get into is motivation. And there's several different types of motivation. So we have amotivation, external motivation, introjected, identified, integrated, and intrinsic. So motivation to be physically active, it's another key component of physical literacy. And it involves the inspiration to complete a task. So this is all based on the self-determination theory, and it's a popular meta-theory that has been applied to physical activity promotion. The two researchers that are primarily do a lot of work with this are Decky and Ryan. But simply stated, the self-determination theory distinguishes between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And these are the 6 different types of motivation, or we also talk them as regulation. So internal or external regulation. So those are some things that we look at. But the bottom 3, the identified, the integrated, the intrinsic, those are self-determined forms of regulation. Those are things that we're doing for ourselves. So the most self-determined form of motivation is intrinsic regulation. And that's where an individual will engage in physical activity for enjoyment. So they're doing it because they want to. There's joy, there's positive emotions, there's positive feelings for it. And not everybody's going to have an intrinsic motivation. There may be very, very different ways or reasons why people may exercise or not exercise. So amotivation is without motivation. They're not going to. So amotivation is characterized as having no intention to exercise. But the goal is to help students to become more self-determined. And if they're more self-determined, they're going to be more likely to engage in more physical activity. So those are some things that we look at. External motivation, on the other hand, again, it's an outward focus where activity is pursued because it'll lead to a separate outcome. It could be a consequence. There could be a reward or maybe even a punishment. But we want to develop these internal or these self-determined types of motivation. And those are things that we really want to work on developing and fostering with the students so they can be more likely to engage in the physical activity. So when we look at in terms of developing motivation, a few different things that we look at. There's several basic needs that support an individual in becoming more self-determined with their motivation. So autonomy is one of the things that we focus on. So autonomy involves being able to make and pursue choices. So learning how to develop goals and choose activities in pursuit of improving physical activity, that can benefit the development of autonomy. So autonomy, they're developing it. And that even gets into you look at some of that task self-efficacy in terms of the scheduling self-efficacy. So there's a carryover between the self-efficacy and the motivation as well. They will impact each other. Now we look at competence. And competence involves the self-efficacy of performing activity. And one of the things, there's a lot of research on sport sampling. And some of you may have experience, you've heard people where they do year-round activities, whether it's baseball or volleyball or soccer, where they're doing one sport, and that's all that kids may do. But sampling is something that is more important. So by sampling a variety of recreational activities, an individual can find out what they enjoy. So if an activity is fun and engaging, individuals may be more likely to pursue it as skills are developed. And individuals should be encouraged to find activities they enjoy. And one of the things related to this, down at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, they have a program, it's called Moving On. And what they've found is a lot of collegiate athletes who are just doing one sport. And you may have even heard this from even high school athletes, if they're not playing at the next level. Once their season's over, or once they're done high school, or once they're done college, they are not doing that sport anymore, and their activity just drops off. So with the Moving On program, this is something they're doing. They're trying to introduce those athletes over their last year, developing their physical literacy, sampling some different activities, whether it's yoga or other different leisure time sports, so that they can see what they like, expose them to different activities so they can continue to move on and remain physically active afterwards. So those are some different things that sometimes you hear. I know with a lot of my students coming into college from the high school, that's something they talk about a lot in terms of how they were high school athletes, and they miss that team aspect. And some people are motivated by working out with others. And some people are motivated just by themselves, working out by themselves. Some people like that team construct, and that's something to think about. So we have autonomy, competence. The next thing we have is relatedness. And relatedness is rooted in social support. So having opportunities to share experiences and plans for physical activity with others can be a means to foster relatedness. And some of this relatedness, again, can be facilitated through some of these smaller group discussions where individuals are sharing their thoughts on some of the discussions, and they're realizing, oh, that's me. And they see that they're not alone, that there are other people that are experiencing things similar to them. So those things that are important. But moving on, we talk about goal setting. And goal setting is another strategy to aid motivation. So goals can be structured using the SMART acronym. And using this structure, goals should be specific, measurable, acceptable, realistic, and time-bound. And I know there's some other different words that people have used with the SMART goal construct, but these are the ones that I like. These are the ones that I focus on with my students, making sure the students develop specific goals that are measurable, that they're going to be able to measure, track their progress, see when they've attained that goal, making sure that goal is acceptable to them, making sure it's realistic, and making sure it's time-bound. One of the things that I really work with my students is to develop two goals, one a fitness goal and one a wellness goal. And I really instruct them that I do not want a weight-centric goal. If their goal is to lose weight, don't focus on the weight loss, but focus on the behaviors that will lead to the weight loss. So if there's something they want to modify within their diet in terms of making sure they're eating a certain number of servings of whole grains per day, or if there's certain things they want to look at in terms of how many minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity they're going to be doing, those should be the focus, because those are things. Weight loss is not a behavior. Weight loss is an outcome of the behaviors. These are things that I really try to focus on and provide students feedback with, so they are able to develop goals that they can use throughout their lifetime to measure and assess their progress. And those are things that are important. So aside from weekly journals, students participate in a lot of discussion boards, so to talk about that already. And for many of the discussions, I randomly divide the students up into 2 or 3 groups, depending on the size of the class. So I like to have smaller groups, again, somewhere around 8 to 10 students, that I find tends to work best, because sometimes as you move through the semester, sometimes students aren't as active. You need to kind of engage them, re-engage them. But those tend to be a good number a size that I've found. But the smaller group environment is designed to foster greater dialogue and also support among those students. So you get into that relatedness, and that's something that's very important. So one of my discussions focuses on a reading that they do online that is looks at barriers to physical activity. So students can share information in that smaller group about some of their own barriers, but not just barriers, but also facilitators to physical activity, and then even solutions. So there is a lot of work that the students will do in terms of sharing, offering suggestions, support, and that's something that really helps with developing that relatedness, and that's something that I've learned that the students really enjoy. Now, content that I have is also present that looks specifically at the benefits of physical activity. So these are the things. So a discussion early in the semester I use to engage students on different types of physical activity and what kind of things they prefer to do. And students are also asked to think about other new types of physical activity that they might want to do or try. So those are things. And that's helpful, again, for the students to develop that autonomy, to develop that relatedness and share and see what other students, what their peers are doing, and have that discussion. So those are things that we look at. So weekly journals are used to reinforce competence in physical activity. And as an instructor, I comment on each weekly journal. So those are things that we look at. But students also learn how to develop and refine their SMART goals. Now we look at motivation. One of the things that I do, again, from the assessment piece, the tool that I use is the Behavior Regulation Exercise Questionnaire, the BREC 3, and you can Google this online. And there's a really neat website, I think it's out of the UK, and they talk about all those 6 types of motivation. They have different little case studies, little blurbs about 6 different individuals and explain how and why they're having each one of those types of regulations. So those are things that are important to look at. But the Behavior Regulation Exercise Questionnaire, it's used to assess motivation in my classes. So this is another, again, they do a self-efficacy assessment at the beginning, middle, and end. They do a motivation survey at the beginning, middle, end, so it's all tied together, and I'll show you that in just a second. But it consists, the BREC 3 consists of 24 questions, which are equally distributed to assess the 6 motivational categories. And students use the scale shown in this example over here to rate how true each of the statements is for them. And these questions are then grouped by type and then average to determine how each type of motivation and look at it and the influence it has on physical activity. So for this question here, I get pleasure and satisfaction from participating in exercise. So they go not true for me all the way to very true for me using this scale. Now moving on, one of the things that we look at, and I did talk about in terms of the integrity of the physical activity that they're performing. And with the emergence and ubiquity of physical activity trackers, documenting daily physical activity is fairly easy. So physical activity trackers have many features, and they can assist with setting a goal for steps. So individuals can pull out their phone or their app and slide what their goal is. And we often hear about 10,000 steps per day, or however many minutes of moderate physical activity per day, moderate to vigorous physical activity. So those are things they can set up in their floors. They can also look at in terms of flights of steps climbed. And users can take instant feedback on their workout. They can also receive move reminders. So if they've been fairly active, you can set it up where it'll vibrate, their tracker will vibrate, and like, oh, I've been sitting down for 2 hours. I need to get up and move around a little bit. So those are some different things. But you pair them with an app, and there's a lot of information from those apps that individuals can use. So there are a lot of tools. Sleep monitoring is something that's really interesting. I don't know if anyone here has used physical activity trackers, and sometimes it's a little sad to see how much sleep we get or don't get. So that's something to look at. So there are some neat things that we can use in harnessing those tools. So when we look at in terms of the physical activity tracker, it's a requirement for my courses that I teach. So for my lifetime fitness and wellness It's a requirement. And many students already have one, but because it's a listed course requirement, any student who receives financial aid can use their financial aid money to purchase a physical activity tracker from our bookstore. So that's something that has helped. So those are some things that we look at. 2 challenges related to physical activity trackers, including wear time compliance. So sometimes students don't always wear their tracker. They may put it on just when they work out, in terms of not all the time. Or the other thing is in terms of charging them. So sometimes they won't charge it regularly. Some of the trackers will go for 5 days or 7 days. Some of them go for 1 or 2 days. So it's good for students to get into a habit of charging it when maybe they charge their phone. So those are things to look at. But I encourage students to develop a system where they even charge it when they bathe, because some of the trackers are waterproof, some aren't. Even if they are waterproof, some people don't like to wear it when they bathe, so they might just take it off. So those are things. But developing those patterns of putting things on, putting the tracker on, maybe when they grab their phone, put it on. And I also encourage students to set up push notifications on the phone so they know when their battery's getting low, so the phone will notify them. So one of the things that I use is a website that has the capability to sync multiple devices and import the moderate to vigorous physical activity onto a leaderboard or a challenge board. So that's something that I use. The site is inkin.com, inkin.com. I know recently, over the last few weeks, I was getting ready for my summer course. They actually started charging a fee for it. So I think that may be something that I'll look into adding on to as a course fee for students. I think it's like $6 per semester, so it's nothing outrageous or anything like that. But the one nice thing about that site, many of the activity trackers, you can log on to the website or the phone, and you can manually log activity. But when I use the InKin site, the activity that it pulls in is only the activity that is captured while wearing the device. So it does not, you can set it up so it does not include manually logged minutes. That way there's more accountability. The students know that they have to wear their tracker. They have to make sure that it syncs properly. It's not that hard to sync. So you just log into the InKin site, set up a profile, and then add in which tracker it is. So those are things that we do. But it's compatible with several popular brands of physical activity trackers. So each week I log on to the InKin site, I do a printout so I can kind of track how many minutes are logged, and I look over in terms of the semester. So I have a semester total of 1,500 minutes they have to complete. And I have a weekly minimum of 75 minutes that they need to complete, which is below what at least in terms of moderate activity, the moderate intensity activity recommendation is 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity, or 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity, or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity activity. So those are some things I want them to do, at least 75 minimum each week. Sometimes students meet that 1,500 threshold. But the whole reason the 1,500 came into account is contact time. So if they were taking the class in person, that's how much time would be devoted to physical activity if they were in the classroom taking this class. So those are some things that we look at. But each week, students automatically get synced to the InKin site with that. But students are talking about in their weekly journals how much activity they did and looking at some of their different behaviors. So knowledge is the next thing. So one of the things that we look at is attaining and applying accurate information or knowledge. It's relevant to physical activity, and it's important. So with my developed course, I organize content online through a course website. So I set up a Google site where I have control over adding and manipulating the links and other content that I have. So I set it up into 6 different modules. And these modules, we use Canvas Learning Management System. So I have the modules set up there so they are congruent with the modules, titles, and objectives and everything like that. But the first week's devoted to getting physical activity tracker set up, understanding the course structure, and tracking the initial assessment. And again, with the website, there's no book cost. The only thing the students need to provide is a physical activity tracker. And if they get financial aid, that's something they can even get through the bookstore, or they can use their existing physical activity tracker as long as it's one of the ones that is compatible with the site that I use. But the second week of the course, it provides an overview of health, wellness, fitness, exercise, and I do discuss the whole concept of physical literacy. And then moving forward, There's additional and more lengthy modules that focus on each component of fitness. We talk about goals, barriers. We look at nutrition, weight management, and then lastly, we talk about disease risk. And there are assignments throughout the semester, discussions where application, personal application is a focus on that. So ultimately, again, one of the goals for this course I have is for the students to understand the importance of physical activity in their daily lives, and then also to be able to develop a plan to incorporate into their lives. And having the physical activity tracker, that's something that helps the students to be more accountable. They see that. They see the numbers on their phone, on their tracker, and they're able to look at that. But then also, again, in terms of being mindful of strategies to overcome barriers that could arise. So this slide here we talk about in terms of assessment timing. So this slide shows each component of physical literacy. And where it's assessed. So during the first week of the semester, I assess each component of physical literacy. So in terms of the BREC 3, the self-efficacy, the task and scheduling self-efficacy, physical activity, I have used in the past as an IPAC questionnaire, International Physical Activity Questionnaire. I also have a stage of changes questionnaire where they're able to look at in terms of if they're in contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, termination. So where they are, what their mindset is relative to physical activity. So those are things. So those are some things that I focus on, but they do those at the beginning, the middle, and the end. I used this model for my dissertation, and I looked at in terms of the knowledge. So I actually did a pre-test. They were graded on it, and then I included those same questions in the final exam as well. But some of the core strategies, and again, implementing a plan to develop and track physical literacy students throughout the semester, it is going to be important. And this shows a summary of each one of the strategies that I use. So again, reflection is a big piece of something that I do. And the one thing to keep in mind is everybody's journey, everybody's physical literacy journey is different. It's going to be unique. And the journals provide an opportunity for them to share their journey and for me to interact with each student on a weekly basis to provide guidance and also support. And students also interact with each other through discussion boards. And those are things that are important. So again, that relatedness is something that's going to be important, that they are going to be able to work with each other. And then we also look at developing each physical literacy component. But students have responded positively to the class content and structure. And in some of my recent class, I've observed a trend of increased intrinsic motivation, increased self-efficacy, both with scheduling and task self-efficacy. So from the beginning to the midpoint of the semester to the end. And that's something they actually do in one of their final assessments. When they're assessing their fitness, there's another thing they do in terms of talking about their changes and that they may have seen. But some of the things that students have commented on were, I'm more motivated to go up every day and exercise. I'm more proactive to do exercise. I fit working out into my busy schedule more. And I started wanting to work out more because it was becoming a habit. So they're getting used to this. They're doing it for the course, and they establish these habits, and they're able to keep doing it. And one of the things, again, from using the tracker, it's a little more realistic. So if someone was taking class 2 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Thursday, for an hour, 15 minutes each day, they're physically going to somewhere. They're doing a structured activity, but then they're going home. With the trackers, they're doing it on their own. They have that autonomy. They have a lot of time and opportunities to fit the physical activity into their day. But as we finish up today, I just want to remind everyone that physical literacy is a journey. Each individual has their own path to follow and develop and grow. So those are things that are important. But as educators, there's things that we can do to enhance the physical literacy journeys for each student we encounter. And refining these assessments to allow for deeper self-reflection is something that's critical. And also application of the content. So what are they doing to use that content and focus it? So those are things that we look at. But hopefully each of you will be able to implement some of these strategies to enhance the physical literacy of our students. And thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions,